Hi everyone and welcome to IDG Live. Today we are looking at Viserys II. That guy there, not to be confused obviously with Viserys I, who we met in House of the Dragon, or Viserys III, who is Dany's older brother in Game of Thrones. This person is the Viserys that we do see just briefly in House of the Dragon as a baby. I'll get back onto that in just one moment. If this is your first time watching, then welcome. It's great to see you. What I will be doing today, as always, I will start with a brief outline of who this character is, all of the history that we know about them. Then I've got some questions from my patrons, and I will try and pick up as many questions as I can in the chat as we go along. This is one of those characters who I think is fascinating. Absolutely one of the most intriguing Targaryens that we have. However, we don't have huge amounts of information about him. He comes into his own just as Fire and Blood Part 1 ends. So we know a reasonable amount about his early life, quite a lot less about his later life. But let's get into it. So, Viserys II is the second-born son of Daemon and Rhaenyra Targaryen. The Daemon and Rhaenyra we know from House of the Dragon. He grew up on Dragonstone not thinking that he would be king. He was fifth in line to the throne. There were three half-brothers that he had, Rhaenyra's sons from her first marriage, and then he also had an older brother himself, Aegon. He will not have thought that he was going to be king any day. And he, however, was brought up in a very Targaryen kind of atmosphere at Dragonstone, and he was given a dragon egg, though that dragon never hatched. We saw him in House of the Dragon being presented to Viserys I as a baby. Now, this is a little bit of a timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly thing here for the TV show, because in the book, then he's 6 or 7 at the outbreak of war, but there they made him a baby. They squashed a lot of those little timelines quite a bit, but in the book then he's 6 or 7 at the outbreak of war, and a decision is made relatively quickly that by Viserys, who is the heir from the Black perspective, he is the heir to the throne, that he and his elder brother Aegon should be sent off to safety over in Essos. So they get put onto a boat called the Gay Abandon, and they sail off towards Essos. However, so I think it was Pentos was where the was supposed to be going to. However, the timing could not have been worse. As that boat heads out, that is when a Triarchy fleet arrives. This Triarchy fleet will eventually be defeated. It will head back, limp its way back to Essos, but not until it has captured this boat, which has got these 2 young princes on. Now, we were talking about Aegon, the elder brother here, who became Aegon III. A few weeks ago, he climbs onto the back of his dragon, very young dragon. He's still himself very young, and they fly back to Dragonstone. And this is the first time that he's ever flown his dragon, and his dragon sadly dies, but he survives, and he gives the news. Our boat has been attacked. The dragon seeds head off. The fleet is largely destroyed, and the assumption is that Viserys must have died. Now, they don't really follow up on this. Team Black, to be fair to them, they do have other things to be worrying about. They're in the middle of a civil war, but the assumption that they have, as the months and years go by, they hear nothing. Most of those boats had sunk. The assumption is he must be dead. But he's not. He manages to survive, and he eventually ends up in Lys, and he ends up being made the ward. They discover who he is. He's made the ward of House Roger, which was quite a powerful house in the free city of Lys. Now, for those who don't know Lys, it's not really played a huge role yet in A Song of Ice and Fire. It's on an island just off of the south of Essos. It's one of those places that got a very strong link across to old Valyria. So the noble families there, they are very Valyrian. And so they welcome in Viserys. They see an opportunity here. And House Roger at the time, they're not just a wealthy and influential family. They own a bank, the Bank of Roger. And at this moment in time, that bank has done so well that it's now challenging the Iron Bank of Braavos itself. We think of the Iron Bank as being like the big bank without comparison in this world. At this moment in time, there is a challenger, and the challenger is the Bank of House Roger. Anyway, over on Westeros, the war ends, and there aren't that many survivors from House Targaryen. Aegon III this is Viserys' older brother, has now acceded to the throne. He's too young, so there's a regency going on. There are people ruling on his behalf, but he is technically the king. But he has been racked with guilt. He's been traumatized by the entire war. One of the things that is traumatizing him is the fact that he escaped on the back of his dragon and left his brother, his best and closest friend, he thinks, to die on that boat. He survived. He left his brother to die. Then the message comes through. Viserys is alive. And House Roger, looking for a bit of a quick buck here, go, well, you can have him back, but there are some conditions. One of these conditions is that he has to stay married to this woman, Lara Roger, because they've married him into the family by this point. She's 6 years older than him. She doesn't seem particularly into it, but this is a political marriage. That marriage has to stay. They have to pay a huge amount of money over to House Roger. House Roger has to have all of these chances to be investing in the Seven Kingdoms. Basically, they see an opportunity to be expanding their business empire into Westeros and get the best possible head start that they can through the royal family. So, Aegon agrees to all of this. He's so racked with guilt about possibly having left his brother to die. Finally, he gets this chance to get his brother back. He'll pay anything. Huge amounts of money goes to House Roger, and Viserys returns. And he returns with his wife. And what follows is known as the Lysene Spring. This is a really interesting bit of Westerosi history. Just after the Dance of the Dragons, the continent is still on its knees. Most of the major houses are not really paying much attention to what's going on in King's Landing. And House Roger see an opportunity. They come in and they set up a bank in King's Landing. They buy lots of businesses. They come in with all of their strange foreign customs. Everyone's going, oh, wow, this is exciting and exotic. And for it's not just one season, it's about a year or so. Everything is well with this. The Rogers are the most important and influential family in Westeros. However, things start to go wrong. Now, we see this in Fire and Blood very much from the lens of what happens in Westeros, where people eventually they start. I mean, I think the only real way to say this is there's a degree of ethnocentricity happening here. People are not liking the fact that Lara, for example, although she never learns Westerosi. She doesn't learn the common tongue. She doesn't adopt any local cultures or religions. She brings her worship of her old gods, which everybody is very suspicious of. And there's lots of very strange behavior, like having lots of cats. She likes cats. It's the kind of thing that makes people go, I'm not sure whether we want this strange foreigner here in such an incredibly influential position, and there is an attempt to get rid of her. But we see all of this from the Westerosi perspective. What is even bigger in a geopolitical position, sort of from a geopolitical perspective, is the fact that, although we're not told in so many words, the very, very clear suggestion is that the Iron Bank of Braavos have finally decided they're not going to allow this pretender to start challenging their position as being the preeminent global bank. And the two most influential and important members of House Rogaire die. They have accidents within a couple of days of each other. One of them chokes on some bacon, we're told. Another one has a boating accident. Nobody's really fooled by this. They know this is the Faceless Men of Braavos doing what the Faceless Men of Braavos do. And House Rogaire, then things come up that perhaps, maybe they've not been as above board as everybody thinks that they might have been. Maybe there have been a few dodgy dealings going on there. The person who takes over as the new head of House Rogaire is in no way as efficient and effective as his predecessors. There is basically a run on the bank. People go to the bank and take their money out. House Rogaire suddenly, almost overnight, loses power and influence. In Westeros, people hear about this as well. The bank there also starts to suffer problems. The powers that be in Westeros, people who are trying their best to be pushing for influence, people like Unwin Peake, for example, who is desperately trying to use this moment as his opportunity to get the greatest possible power he can for himself and his family. They start pushing against the Rogaires, and everything comes crashing down. The culmination of all of this is what is known as the Secret Siege. We get King Aegon, Viserys and his wife, who stay in Maegor's Holdfast, which is like a keep within the main Red Keep itself, and people are trying to, the powers that be within the Red Keep are trying to do two things, really: get rid of the Rogaires, and also they've seen that Aegon III is probably not the most charismatic character to be leading, and they want to get their own person there. So some of them are trying to get Viserys onto the throne. Others are trying to get Aegon to be married to somebody that they think will allow them to control him. But this secret siege carries on for nearly 2 weeks. Viserys, Aegon, Lara, they stay within the Maegor's Holdfast, and they survive. They pull through on the other side, and the Unwin Peake and co have to back down eventually. Now, we move forward a little bit. Lara Rogaire, although her family has lost all its power and influence, she stays in King's Landing for a while longer. They have 3 children, her and Viserys. The oldest is Aegon, who will become Aegon IV, who we will talk about next week. Then there's also Aemon, who becomes the Dragon Knight, one of the most famous and celebrated of Targaryens, who does not become king, and also Nerys, who becomes the wife of Aegon IV. At which point, though, Lara decides enough is enough. She doesn't want to be in King's Landing anymore. She never really did want to be in King's Landing, in all truth, and so she heads back over to Lys, and she leaves her children, she leaves Viserys, and she's really not come again, in all honesty. But Viserys stays. After she has gone, Viserys becomes more insular. It's probably fair to say. He becomes more focused on day-to-day work, things that he has to do. His joy in life has gone, which kind of makes him a match for his brother, Aegon III, who really is so still traumatized from what happened in the Dance of the Dragons. What happened, that's the point at which we get the end of Fire and Blood Part 1, the book. Which means that the information we have about Viserys after that is quite limited. Now, we know that for the last few years of Aegon III's reign, Viserys becomes Hand of the King. He remains Hand of the King then for the next 2 kings after that, the kings that we've been talking about just before. Deeren I with his invasion of Dorne, and then Baelor the Blessed with his huge attempts to turn the 7 kingdoms to the faith of the 7. Now, we don't read huge amounts about what happened during that period, what he, as a Hand of the King, was doing. We do, however, then get this. Let me see whether I've got this exchange, which is in the Song of Ice and Fire, which probably I've got a question about this in detail later, so I'm not going to analyze it too much, but this sort of summarizes how Viserys is seen, because after the death of the Baelor, he then becomes king. Now, this is a conversation between Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper, and Tyrion, 2 well-read people, but with slightly different perspectives on life. I once had the great good fortune to see the Citadel's copy of Lives of 4 Kings, Prince Oberyn was telling Tyrion. The illuminations were wondrous to behold, but Caith was too kind by half to King Viserys. Tyrion gave him a sharp look. Too kind? He scants Viserys shamefully, in my view. It should have been Lives of 5 Kings. The prince laughed. Viserys hardly reigned a fortnight. He reigned more than a year, said Tyrion. Oberyn gave a shrug. A year or a fortnight, what does it matter? He poisoned his own nephew to gain the throne, and then did nothing once he had it. Baelor starved himself to death, fasting, said Tyrion. His uncle served him loyally as hand, as he had served the young dragon before him. Viserys might only have reigned a year, but he ruled for 15, while Deeren warred and Baelor prayed. And if he did remove his nephew, can you blame him? Someone had to save the realm from Baelor's follies. So we have straight away the introduction of this idea that perhaps Viserys had killed his nephew Baelor. We touched on this last time when we were looking at Baelor. This idea that he had perhaps killed Baelor in order to gain the throne. But then, as Oberyn says, he did nothing once he got it. He didn't actually do anything with the throne once he killed Baelor. Now, we can talk a little bit later about whether he did actually kill Baelor or not. But the fact is that he, having been Hand of the King for 15 years or so by that point, he then became king and was then king for only just over a year. And we are told what he did. We're told as a king the things that he got up to, but they're not particularly exciting, it has to be said. They're not the kind of things that, when you compare to the 2 kings that preceded him, invading Dorne, these commissioning the building of the Great Sept of Baelor, none of that. What he does do is 3 or 4 boring but sensible things. He pushes for greater trade agreements with Essos. He goes back to the old rule books, the codification of laws that Charis I had started, to see whether he could expand them to get a greater set of laws which governed the land. He did some reassessment of the role of the royal court, things which are not exciting, but probably they're the bread and butter of how to rule a kingdom wisely, except for the fact that he only had a year. So he didn't really get a chance to do any of this. At the end of which he was 47, I think, when he became king. Within the year, he caught some sort of virus and died very quickly, and then his son Aegon took over. There was then another set of rumors that perhaps Aegon had been doing a little bit of poisoning, hurrying this process along, because though we'll come to Aegon next time, but although Viserys spent his entire life not thinking he was going to be king because he was never really next in line, you get Aegon, who, the moment that Deeren died, probably thought that he was definitely going to be king, because Baelor, when he was king, that he never looked like he was going to leave an heir. He was married, but he didn't want to be married. He got his marriage annulled. He wasn't leaving an heir. Then it went back up the generation to Viserys, and then obviously Aegon would follow that. So Aegon, for a few years, had thought that he was going to be king. Anyway, Viserys died. Whether it was just one of those things or he was rushed along by Aegon IV, for these purposes, is neither here nor there. He did not ever have a strong, a real time to shape the kingdom under his rule. So that's Viserys II. He is generally seen as being one of the most intriguing and one of the most influential characters within the Targaryen rule, and yet we don't know huge amounts about him. So with that, I think I've got some questions from my patrons. I'll get to this is one of those characters, it has to be said, I should probably say straight up, because he appears outside of the scope of Fire and Blood Part 1, or at least his being king does. This means that we've actually got a bit more of a limited amount of information. So he is fascinating, but perhaps we've not got as much to go on as before. But let's quickly flick into the chat, see what we're going on. Andrew K, oh, great to see you, Andrew. I hope all is well with you. John Potts saying being a good king in the history books generally means fighting lots of wars, but as Jorah says, the people just want to be left alone, and they never are. Greet Weirwood saying, I still wonder whether Viserys was the one who saved the documents from Baelor that Tyrion and Rhaegar reference. It's entirely possible. The rumors, I don't think I've got a specific question about this from my patron, so I'll answer this one now. The rumors that he perhaps killed Baelor, we did cover when we were looking at Baelor, but there's not huge amounts of evidence one way or the other. The thing is that Baelor had been fasting for 40 days. So at the very, very least, he was going to be physically very weak at that point. Now, this wasn't a one-off. It wasn't just he fasted for 40 days. So it's a bit of a mystery after that why he might have died. He regularly did this and he scourged himself and he deprived himself. He was quite weak to start with, so it's entirely feasible that 40-day fast did indeed kill him. Might Viserys have got rid of him? The argument in favor, I think, is quite a kind of realpolitik one, which is that Baelor, as we looked at a couple of weeks ago, he was so obsessed with his religion that he wished to spread across the Seven Kingdoms. He was then getting to the point where he thought we should make everybody worship the Seven. Not just the people who do already. We should go out and we should force others to do that. Everyone within the realm should be worshipping the Seven, and in particular, that would have meant the Iron Islands and the North being forced to change their religions. Both almost certainly would have resisted, probably violently, it has to be said, particularly given the fact that the Targaryens no longer had dragons. So if there is a case to be made for Viserys having killed Baelor, this is his nephew, let's not forget, then it, I suspect, is on a very realpolitik view to keep the Seven Kingdoms together. Had a question from Andrew Cage is saying Baelor needed taking out. Forced conversion idea would have led to utter carnage. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to disagree with that. Bradley Kaleido Swain saying not really relevant, but were there any gay kings? Finally caught a stream. This is the first time I've given a content creator money. Love you guys. Well, welcome. It's fantastic to see you here. Were there any gay kings? This is I mean, there are certainly lots of gay characters within the world of A Song of Ice and Fire. Renly counted himself a king, and he definitely was gay. There are a lot of characters like Laenor, who obviously was close to the throne, could have been king, and was definitely gay. There are a few characters a bit later on within the Targaryen dynasty that you wonder whether they might have been. Certainly there were quite a few Targaryens who weren't in the direct line of succession but were gay. In terms of the people that you see listed on that from Aegon the Conqueror list all the way down Aenys and Maegor, etc., that list, there are none that are officially gay. Let's put it that way. There may well have been some who were unofficially gay, who just didn't come out. Because coming out was, I mean, this is obviously medieval world, so it's a very, very different context. Okay, let's go to a question from Diego Godoy saying, in the long run, did the Roger family get anything out of the marriage of Lara with Viserys? She left Westeros after only 5 years living there. Did the Roger make the mistake of giving up? Did the Rogers make the mistake of giving up their control of Viserys, or was this unavoidable to some extent? Well, I think what they did quite cleverly and sensibly was not make him feel that he was a captive. They actually, he did actually seem to genuinely want to be married to Lara, so it wasn't this forced marriage kind of thing. Yes, it was definitely a political marriage, but if he had wanted out, then he probably, by the time he got back to King's Landing, he could have got out. Now, did they get anything? They could have done, is the short answer. They shot their shot. They took their moment. They had reached a point where within Essos, their bank and their influence within Lys in particular, but across Essos and the Free Cities with the bank, was almost maxed out. It was at their height. Then they saw this opportunity. Can we expand out into Westeros? Because they haven't got this connected banking system that they had in Essos. Westeros, let's not forget, in many ways technologically and culturally was a little way behind the Free Cities of Essos. And it's only, as an aside, it's only after this, one of the weird sort of offshoots of all of this is that the Hightowers saw what House Regier had done and went, a bank, now that's a good idea. And then they went off and set up their own bank, which then became incredibly powerful and gained more money power for House Hightower. But House Regier had the opportunity, if their two leading lights had not been killed by the Iron Bank, then I think there's every chance that they, and if they'd worked slightly more sympathetically with the Westerosian market, if they had tried not just to come in and show the commercial prowess, but actually people like Lara had embraced Westerosi culture and made people like them rather than be suspicious of them, then there was definitely a chance that they could have expanded out into Westeros and been hugely powerful. So it was just that the Iron Bank did not want that. They wanted to take them back down a peg or two. So did they make a mistake in giving up their control of Viserys? I don't think so, because if they'd kept him, eventually it would have come out that that's where he was, and if he was being there kept as a prisoner, then I feel absolutely certain that Aegon would have launched a war to get his brother back. This is not a thing that he would have thought about twice. This was one of the few things which made him absolutely passionate about. What the House Regier did was they set a very high price, and then they got it for getting the Viserys, or handing Viserys back effectively. Now, one could perhaps argue that maybe what they should have done is accepted that was it. That was their time. Not keep on pushing, but that seems not to be in their nature. So I think the short answer to this is that they didn't succeed, but it was nothing to do with their handling of the Viserys situation. They actually probably did quite well as regard the Viserys situation. True Yellow Dart saying Aegon III would have been terrifying if he learned about Viserys and had to fight to get him back. Yeah, absolutely. Andrew K saying, given a long reign, I believe Viserys could have been in the top 5 Targaryen monarchs interested in ruling and seemed keen on positive reforms. Yeah, definitely he was. He actually cared about ruling. Now, this is one of the things that we should. We're not told huge amounts of detail about what he was doing as Hand of the King, but when he did get the reins of power himself, he went straight away. His priority was how to rule better. It wasn't to do whatever pet project that he'd had in the back of his mind for all of this time, invading Dawn, converting everybody to the faith of the Seven. So, yeah, I agree. He's potentially could have been a very, very good king. Jay saying, can you go into further detail about what the Regiers wanted during the Regency? Also, do we know anything about Dana's life after Viserys is crowned and their relationship? Okay, so first of all, just to sort of round off with the Regiers, what were they wanting during the Regency? Power, money. It's actually not that. I think it's not that deep. I think that they saw an opportunity to, as several other people did. Unwin Peak is the classic example. They saw an opportunity where the Seven Kingdoms had been ripped apart by war, where the elder statesmen who had been guiding the Seven Kingdoms for so long were no longer there. The people who'd been brought up, trained to rule, were not there. The lords paramount of the major houses were almost all children at this point. There was an opportunity, and they went in and tried to get power. So that's what it was. And power for them was about money. If you imagine them as being a bit like Littlefinger, that's probably the closest you're going to get. They saw this opportunity to make a lot of money out of this and gain power. And they did for a short period of time. Dana. Do we know anything about Dana after Viserys is crowned, or their relationship? So, Dana is the sister of Baelor and Deeren. Now, she, you will remember, was one of the three was put into the Maiden Vault. Baelor decided, my sisters, they should not be allowed out. They would tempt people too much by their beauty. I wish to protect them. I'm going to lock them up in a tower, basically, and not let them out. Dana, however, became pregnant. So something went wrong. It turns out later that the father of this, she didn't admit this at the time, but the father of that child was the future Aegon IV, so Viserys' son. And the baby that emerges from all of that is Daemon, who will be Daemon Blackfire in time, who will cause the Blackfire rebellions. So what happens to Dana? Well, caught in the Maiden Vault, and she seems to be quite the character to start with. She is described as being incredible, even for a Targaryen, incredibly beautiful, with quick wit, intelligence. She loved hunting. She was a great horsewoman, great archer, and she became pregnant and had her child. And after that, we hear nothing, which is the honest and very annoying answer here. George R. R. Martin basically sets up this really fascinating character, a character who gives birth to one of the most important Targaryens there is. And then what do we have in... so she doesn't appear in Fire and Blood Part 1. What do we have in the World of Ice and Fire? Just a few mentions of her after that. She has a child. Eventually it becomes apparent who the father is, and then that's it. This isn't a big conspiracy. This happens to a lot of absolutely fascinating characters in that period, because of the fact that in the World of Ice and Fire it just doesn't give us a full history. So we get a lot of characters. Charis is another character who is like this. Charis is built up as being this great magic user, one of the most beautiful women of her age, that she had an on-off relationship with Bloodraven. She's incredibly powerful and influential, but then we don't hear any more about her. What happens to her? We simply don't know. And that's the same idea that we have here going on with Dana, unfortunately. Ranabir Mitra saying, I hope you're well, Robert. Thank you very much. I am. I've wondered whether it was Viserys who procured Dark Sister from Vhagar's remains and was its holder until Aemon. GGMU and Mod Love. Well, GGMU indeed, waiting for the details of a takeover. Come on. Mod Love, moderators, thank you. You do an amazing job. If you are watching this live, if you're in the chat, then please do show a little bit of love to the moderators. They do a wonderful job. In terms of Dark Sister, so yes, there's a gap here in knowing where Dark Sister is. So Dark Sister was held by Daemon Targaryen, and he, I should say, spoilers here for the House of the Dragon, probably. The general rule is that show spoilers are not okay, book spoilers are. The book has been out for quite a while. The show is sticking roughly to the book. There are some changes. I will talk about what happens in the books. It may or may not be what happens on the show. Anyway, in the books, Daemon kills Aemond, and Daemon is the holder of Dark Sister, the second of the two Valyrian steel swords that House Targaryen has. And we are told that Dark Sister is recovered from Aemond. Daemon has thrust it into Aemond, and it's when the bodies are brought out from the God's Eye Lake, and that's where the sword is lodged inside Aemond's head through his eye socket. Then it goes a bit quiet where Dark Sister may be. The next person we hear definitely having it is Aemon the Dragon Knight, who is, and we'll probably talk about him a bit more another time. He's basically a bit of a legend as a Targaryen, as a member of the Kingsguard, as an honourable and good and upright person. He wields Dark Sister. Dark Sister, if you remember, tends to go to not the king, but the king's most trusted, next in line person. So this is where Daemon Targaryen gets it, because Viserys I obviously had Blackfyre as king. He gives his brother Dark Sister. It would make sense, if we're following that echoing down, that Aemon III ends up with Blackfyre, and what does he do with this other sword? Yeah, it makes sense that Viserys has it. So Viserys very, very likely did have that. And then where would he pass it afterwards? Well, he may well have it for some time. Blackfyre makes its way down to Deeren. Baelor clearly isn't wanting to have a sword, Valyrian steel or otherwise. So who's the next most obvious person to have it? Well, Aegon the Fourth will get Blackfyre. His brother Aemon will presumably inherit from Viserys. So yes, I think it's very. I don't think we're told specifically, but it's very likely that he is the person who holds it for a while. Let's go to a question from Martin S. saying, what is the shortest distance across the narrow sea? Was Westeros to Essos transportation expensive? So the shortest, technically, I think probably the shortest distance will be across the stepstones from the edge of Dawn across to the disputed lands. However, that is filled with rocks, islands, pirates. That's not a way that people tend to go. The closest 2 points are across to Pentos, the Bravosi coast, that kind of northwest-ish part of the Essosi coast. Now, is it easy to get across? Well, easy enough. It's not just like hopping on a flight is these days, but it's relatively close. As long as you're not veering too far south to go through the stepstones or heading too far north near places like Skagos, then probably you're going to be okay. Was transportation expensive? Well, yes. In terms of if you were just a normal person, if you're a member of the small folk, then you wouldn't really be able to buy transport. But that's not really how the system worked. If you wished to go across, then you would find yourself a boat and then you would work your passage. That's generally the way that these things tended to work. If you wished to buy a boat and then man a boat with all of the sailors you needed to sail you across, then that would, yes, be very expensive and only for the 1%. Have a quick flick through the chat. Kolnitsky saying the shortest is the way that the Andals came to Westeros. Yeah, the Andals, let's not forget, the Andal invasion took place over centuries. But yes, they headed over, first of all, to, if you imagine your map of Westeros, you've got to the Vale of Arryn, that point there, across to the Braavosi coast to Pentos. That is the shortest period. Noah Holland saying Cracklaw points to the Prince's Shore. Very probably, but as the crow flies is probably the shortest. Braavos to the Vale, Agreed Weirwood, or Pentos to King's Landing. Yeah, King's Landing is a bit more sort of inland, so it's obviously on the coast, but you get the you have to sail into it. So there are some bits there. Ranabir Mitra saying, did I just find a tinfoil theory that Robert agreed to? Definitely a first for me. Thank you. Yeah, I do. I do like tinfoil theories. If something can be backed up, then I'm happy to subscribe to it. That's not a problem. Charis Ballerina saying, who do you think will wield Dark Sister in the main series? Okay, well, I'm very happy. This is a digression, but I think it's a good one. So let's go with this one. Dark Sister, the last known owner of Dark Sister, the sword, is Bloodraven, Brynden Rivers. Now, we know that he held that all through his time as Hand of the King. When A History of Westeros, friends of the channel, were, this is a few years ago now, but they were at an event where it was a Q&A event with George R.R. Martin, and one of them, I think it might have been a Shire, stood up and asked the question, which... And if you've ever been like within the fandom, when you know that there's a George R.R. Martin Q&A coming up, everybody's just like going through what questions do we ask him, because he's not going to give anything away. He's these days he never gives any new information away. So the question is, can you find, or the game is, can you find a question that he is willing to give an answer to that is not just keep reading? And they came up with one, which was, did Bloodraven take Dark Sister with him to the wall when he went to join the Night's Watch? And the answer was yes. So that's the last moment that we know that where Dark Sister was. Dark Sister then disappeared. Now, Bloodraven also disappeared. He went ranging north of the wall. The assumption is that he went ranging north of the wall with Dark Sister, and it would be remiss and odd if he hadn't have been taking his Valyrian steel sword with him. And then, as we know, he meets up with the Children of the Forest, becomes the Three-Eyed Crow, etc., etc. Now, what that would mean is that sword is almost certainly in the cave where Bran is now. Now, on the TV show, for those with long memories, and we shouldn't take the TV show as being accurate to what's going to happen in the books, but there were some times when the showrunners had obviously been told something by George R.R. Martin, and they kind of lingered on it with kind of like a nod and a wink to the audience. Classic example, if you remember when we had the flashback scene of at the Tower of Joy, and then you saw a sword propped up there against the bed with Lyanna, and that was the sword Dawn, which is going to be hugely important in the books. Wasn't important in the show, but they wanted to show that they knew about this, and they wanted to show that they knew that was where the sword was at the time. In the show, when Bran and Meera escape Bloodraven's cave, there's a moment when Meera is running through a cave, stops, looks around, sees a sword just leaning up against the cave wall, and then grabs it and keeps running. It felt to me as if that was like one of those little nods that the showrunners did to, oh, this is a thing. They did the same thing with the Horn of Winter. They showed us the Horn of Winter. They didn't use it in the show, but they showed us the Horn of Winter. Now, I've had, ever since then, I've had this is my tinfoil, this is where my tinfoil theories come in from the show, is that I think that was them saying, and Dark Sister is in that cave, and it will come back south with Bran. So, what does that mean for the books? Who's going to be wielding Dark Sister in the books? Well, regardless of whether or not you go with my in the show theory, I think we can be reasonably certain that Dark Sister is at the moment in Bloodraven's cave, and maybe they will just forget it, ignore it, leave it there. But probably it will come back down south with Bran. I do have another. So you got me going off on a complete digression here. We're supposed to be talking about Viserys. I promise we'll get back to Viserys in a moment. I do have another theory here, though, that Hodor, with the hold the door moment, George R. R. Martin has been very clear that the hold the door moment is going to happen in the books. He said that's going to happen in the books. However, it's not going to be the same. It's not going to be, and I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but he basically says it's not going to be literally Hodor holding a door closed. That's not what's going to be happening. It's going to be more like when somebody holds a position to allow others to escape. So he's going to be in a doorway, holding the doorway, preventing people getting past. Now, I do wonder whether, if you think about who is he going to be up against, he's going to be up against the Whites, he's going to be up against the others. How's he going to defend? If it's just him, then he's not going to last long, unless he has a Valyrian steel sword. If he has a Valyrian steel sword, then perhaps Hodor might stand a chance of holding the door for a considerable period of time. So what happens with it? Either option one, it comes south with Bran and ends up with someone like Arya, or Hodor uses it to hold the door. Okay, so that's my complete digression away from Viserys. Jay Carroll, thank you so much for the super chat. I didn't see a question attached to that, but do let one of the moderators know. There was a question attached to that. Reflective Rambling saying we need Kelly, aka J Dead Redhead, here for her sailing expertise if we ever need nautical opinions. Very happy to have expertise from others. That would be really helpful. Maura Lee. Oh, hi there, Maura. Great to see you. Saying just a show of love and support. Thank you so much for all the hard work and excellence. You are the best. Thank you, Maura. I hugely appreciate that. And I see that you can't stay long, but it's great to see you. And thank you so much. Mitchellania saying a stream about Viserys. Bloodraven did it. Yeah. Guilty as charged. Apologies, Morally. Thank you for the super sticker as well. Reflective Rambling saying, could all of Bran's skin changing into Hodor, could it be his last attempt to maybe hold Bloodraven away from Bran as he fears him or more being taken by him? Yep, but possibly. Yeah, that's an interesting thought. Let's go to a question from Michelle Raimo saying, hi, Robert. Hope all is well with you and Dan the dog. Yes, all is well with Dan the dog. Thank you very much. And me. Do you think Viserys' memories or the stories he heard about the dance played a role in how he ruled the realm as Hand and King? And if so, what memories or stories played the biggest role? Okay, so this is, I mean, we always go into sort of bits of psychoanalysis here. But Aegon III clearly was hugely traumatized by what happened in the Dance of the Dragon. Understandably so. He saw almost all of his family killed. He watched his mother being eaten alive by a dragon. This was a huge and horrible time for him. Viserys saw some of that to start with, but he got taken out from all of this. He went over to Lys, and Lys is a pleasure island, actually, but I'm not sure whether I mentioned this at the time. What Lys was as a sort of a city and an island, this was where the Valyrians, the old Valyrians, used to go for their holidays. This is, and pick what in your culture is the equivalent place, but this is where they would go on their summer holidays just to relax. It's beautiful, sandy beaches, beautiful locals. This is where they wanted to be. And that was where Viserys ended up. A really nice place to live. And so, yes, I feel sure that he had some childhood trauma from it, but at the same time, in no way was that the same as what happened to his brother, for example. So when we're thinking about how that might have affected him, he seems to have a slightly more objective approach to these things. The bit of the dynamic that we see between him and Aegon was when Aegon, this is during Regency, Aegon says, "That's it, I hate dragons. No more dragons, no more dragon eggs. All of the dragon eggs have to go out of my sight, away from King's Landing." And Viserys goes, "But, you know, we're Targaryens. Come on. This is, yeah, I know you had bad experiences, but let's not do it." Aegon is king. Aegon gets his way. But Viserys is very much the person there going, well, maybe not. Now, this is interesting because later on, and we haven't seen this yet in Fire and Blood, the book ends before we get to it. The latter part of Aegon III's reign, he changed his view. My best guess is that this is from Viserys. Viserys, who talked him around, who showed him, we've not got any dragons anymore. This suddenly makes us a whole lot less powerful. We really should look to see whether we can do that. The only person that Aegon listened to was his brother Viserys. So I think this is where Viserys comes in, is a very pragmatic approach. This is, yeah, he's seen some bad things, but he wasn't as traumatized as Aegon was. So the big thing, that the thing which seems to have changed his personality the most, is when his wife just says, you know what, that's it. I've had enough of King's Landing. I'm going back home. And that seems to have really impacted on him. But not the dance specifically. So are there any bits of that? I think it's the whole thing. I think he can actually take a step back and go, this is terrible. And this has hugely damaged the Targaryens. What can we do about this? Chelsea Oliver saying, "Hi Robert, hope you're well. Greetings. I was just wondering about your take on what Viserys' relationship with his sisters would be like." Well, so he didn't have any direct sisters with he and Aegon. They were only sons. He did have, there was Visenya. This was, if you remember, in House of the Dragon, Rhaenyra loses a baby right at the beginning of the war. That was going to be Visenya, their sister. So they don't have any direct sisters. Now they've got some half sisters. Their father's daughters from a previous marriage, and they seem to have gotten okay, as far as we can tell. They are a lot more free-spirited than Viserys. Viserys does always come across as being very serious. He comes across as being, charismatic in his own way, but not thinking, "Hey, I'll go off and do all these random adventures," which is what his half sisters were about. It seems to have been a positive relationship, without being something that they really emphasize in the small bit of Fire and Blood that we have. Vic Ilsk saying, "Hello, love your videos. Thank you very much. I was wondering if you get a chance for House of the Dragon or the books, if Rhaenyra had married either of the Lannister men, would that have prevented the entire war?" I don't. I think the short answer is no. So the fact that she married Laenor and then her children were very clearly bastard children rather than Laenor's, to my mind, that wasn't the cause of the war. The cause of the war was that Team Green wanted to have the throne, and this was a really useful thing for them. But this wasn't going to stop it. If Rhaenyra had married someone politically sensible, then I think that they would still have tried to get different alliances and therefore get in, claim the throne through other means. I don't think that was it. The Lannisters is an interesting one, and this is, I'm sure, why you picked it, was because obviously they're a rich family, they're an influential family, they're an old family, and so bringing them on side would have certainly helped, but at the same time, the Velaryons really needed to be brought on side, and if they had been against anyone, they were a huge threat. MXEYWZ saying, "Could you say that Viserys II, was the central figure in securing Targaryen rule without dragons?" I think yes. Now, this ties in, actually, I'll answer this with the question from one of my patrons, Alison, saying, "Viserys only ruled a little over a year himself, but he was Hand of the King for a long time. Where do you see his influence in the reigns of the three kings he served? All three had very different leadership styles and goals. Can you point to anything in each's reign that looked like Viserys' influence?" So this, I think, is the heart of why Viserys is important. Because after the Dance of the Dragons, the entire realm was exhausted. The chances of there being another uprising were pretty minimal. So they had a bit of spare time. Once they got over in the Regency with the coup attempts, which were quite small coup attempts, really. This wasn't Civil War time. This was a small number of people in King's Landing trying to take power. Once you get past all of that, that's when people will have started realizing, and with the dragons dying out and the Targaryens not having new dragons, that's the point at which people have realized that the thing which had kept the Targaryens in power was no longer there, and the potential was there for them to be turfed out of power. Why should they be in power? There is no particular reason why they should be in power if they do not have the dragons. So Viserys's role we don't see because we don't have all of this information, but you have to take it within the context of what was going on. Aegon, through his reign, didn't really engage. He didn't go out. He didn't go out of the Red Keep most of the time. He didn't go exploring the Seven Kingdoms, getting people on side. He didn't try and charm people. He didn't do the Viserys I route of just like having huge tourneys and then giving people lots of big presents and making people happy that way. He didn't do anything really to secure the role of the Targaryens. Then you have Daeron, who spent his entire time as king absolutely fixated on Dawn and marching in there with a massive army, losing tens of thousands of lives, marching out, having claimed victory, realizing that he hadn't actually got the victory, marching back in again, losing even more lives, losing his own life. Then Baelor comes in, and anyone who wasn't a fanatic for the faith of the Seven, suddenly they're not as in favor as they once had been. So each of these three kings had, in their own way, completely ignored the central issue that was going on in Seven Kingdoms at the time, which was, how on earth do you secure the Seven Kingdoms for the Targaryens as rulers without dragons? And it's very clear that the kings themselves didn't do it. Somebody else had to have done it, and that somebody else had to have been Viserys. We do not know yet what he did. We won't know until we get Fire and Blood Part 2. But clearly the Seven Kingdoms were kept together. And Viserys seems to have been the person who did it. Martin S. Has anything like a medieval fantasy equivalent of Operation Overlord or D-Day happened in George R. R. Martin's world history? A large seaborne force storming a fortified beach held by their enemy. It's an interesting question. This is something I might throw to the chat if anyone can think of one in particular. But in terms of where he gets his inspiration from, doesn't tend to be 20th century history. It tends more to be the older European, particularly British, but also sort of Western European history seems to be where he gets his inspiration from. So no, I think is the short answer. I'm assuming this is because we've had the anniversary of D-Day relatively just a couple of days ago, actually. But yeah, there is no specific equivalent like there are in many other sort of historical moments. Cloaked One, hi there, Cloaked One, saying, just a shout out to all the people who are watching this live for the first time, participating in chat for the first time, or super chatting for the first time today. Shout outs to Bradley, Kalyro Swine, Alicia Swegman, Lonely Does, and the Duduk or Duduk, the Dud UK, however you pronounce it. Welcome. Yes, if you are new, it's fantastic to have you here. Do please get involved in the chat. It's very different to just watching these back a bit later, so you are incredibly welcome. And if this is your first time watching these back later, then you're welcome too. But thank you, Cloaked One. Hugely appreciate that. Let's go to a question from Travis saying, hello, Robert. I find Viserys II, Electric Boogaloo, fascinating. He was the de facto day-to-day ruler for 4 reigns, but they were all vastly different. I'm curious what your thoughts are on his ruling philosophy. There doesn't seem to be a consistent through line. For example, he made a lot of reforms during his short reign, but they all seem to have been things the previous 3 rulers would have at worst been ambivalent about. Yeah, so my take is that the thing about Viserys isn't that person with the big vision. He's not the person with this grand idea that has to happen. He's not there going, we have to invade Dawn. We have to convert everybody to this faith. We have to go off and do that particular thing. He's the person who is there just saying, we need to govern sensibly. Perhaps he was a better hand of the king than he would have been king himself. That's entirely possible as far as I'm concerned. But the question is, what is his guiding principle? His guiding principle seems to be, let's be sensible and keep the Targaryens in power, which incidentally does make you wonder whether he did indeed have, we touched on this, I think, almost every single king as we've been going through, whether he had that prophecy. We've talked about this a few times, the Aegon the Conqueror's prophecy, the Song of Ice and Fire, the one that we saw in House of the Dragon that gets passed on down. We saw that it made its way as far as Rhaenyra. What does Rhaenyra do with this? Well, Rhaenyra is, of course, Viserys' mother, and it's easy to forget quite how squashed this bit of family tree is, because we think, oh, we have 4 or 5 kings, we must have passed down several generations. We have not. We get Aegon III and Aegon II and Aegon III are of the same generation. Then you go down one generation for Daeron, and then Baelor, and then back up again to Viserys. So Viserys is literally just one generation down from Rhaenyra. The most likely place, as we've discussed before, the most likely place for this prophecy to have been ignored or lost is with Baelor. But because Baelor gives absolutely, he doesn't like these kind of prophecies and things like that. He burned books of these kinds of things. But it's possible that Viserys did know about this. Maybe he learned about it from his father, Daemon. Maybe he learned about it from his brother Aegon. We don't know, but his general role here does definitely seem to be that he is the person who is just keeping the Targaryens in power, which is very much in line with what the prophecy should be. And he happily supported Daeron trying to get Dawn in, which we've already talked about. It's entirely possible that Daeron I was so focused on getting Dawn in because he was the holder of that prophecy and he wanted a united 7 kingdoms. Viserys will have been the one to have supported him in that. Let's go to question from Andrew K just in the chat saying, I'd say given Daeron's relentless unification pursuits, prophecy likely made it to the prophecy likely made it to him. Baelor I's biggest prophecy killer candidate to me. So yeah, he may well have been the person to have done that. Viserys I, agreed Weirwood saying Viserys II, may have curated a collection of Baelor banned materials that Daeron II, a couple of kings later, moves to Summerhall. Yeah, I mean, I really like that idea. If Viserys, he seemed actively to be working against Baelor behind the scenes. This is just the kind of hints we get. And so when Baelor was burning books, perhaps Viserys would have been the kind of person to save a few of them. And this idea that they got passed on down to Daeron II, who then put them at Summerhall, but then they all got lost in the fire at Summerhall. That's a very George R.R. Martin-y kind of irony. Text one, picking up a question for Callie Summers. Hi there, Callie. Saying, why do you think Viserys was different from Theon? They were both taken as young hostages from noble families, but they were treated like their other children. Theon better than Jon by Cat. Yeah, so there's an interesting kind of parallel lives thing here. So Theon, at a young age, the Theon we know, was taken as a ward to Winterfell, away from his family, and he grew up, as we've seen, to be quite entitled. Viserys ends up effectively being fostered by a family away from his own family, and comes back and seems a lot more grounded. What's the difference? Well, I think the difference is that Theon always thinks that he's going to rule one day. And that seems to be where this is. He thinks that he's above everybody else. He thinks that he is going to be the ruling lord of the Iron Islands at some point. And this brings with it this incredible sense of entitlement. Viserys never thought that he was going to be ruling. He, first of all, he probably thought, I'm just escaping, trying to get away with my life here over in Lys. Then he did genuinely seem to care about his new wife. He seemed delighted to come back. There's at no point when he seems to have thought, oh, I'm next in line here. Because he wasn't for most of the time. So if I had to pick a reason, it probably is that. Let's go to a question from 444 saying, was Viserys II killed? If yes, by whom? And as he was the father of arguably the greatest knight of the Seven Kingdoms, and arguably the worst king of the Seven Kingdoms, was he a conciliator 2.0 or someone who wasted great opportunities? Okay, so a few questions in there. Was he killed, first of all? Now, the rumor that Viserys was killed by Aegon, his son, only seems to have surfaced a few years into his son's reign, once he started getting enemies. So my instinct is that this feels less like somebody knew that happened, and more like this is Aegon IV's enemies trying to make him look even worse. So instinctively, that doesn't feel quite right. But Aegon IV doesn't come across very well. You think he could be capable of it, knowing that he was next in line, knowing he wanted to be king. And his father was, as I say, 47. So you could expect him to survive for a good few years yet. And if Aegon wanted to be king soon, then yeah, why not? So I don't think we've got enough evidence one way or the other to say it. It seems more suspicious than perhaps some of the other ones. Baelor, he had been abusing his own body, 40 days fasting on top of other lots of fasting, that all of that, the snake bites, the long walk to Dawn and back barefoot, these kinds of things, they will have had their effect on his body. So for him to suddenly fall dead kind of makes some sense. Viserys, however, we never get the impression that he did any of those things, and for him to very suddenly catch some illness and then die does feel a little bit suspicious. The second part of this question from 444 is, was he, given the fact that one of his children turns into one of the greatest knights of the Seven Kingdoms and another one turns into one of the worst kings of the Seven Kingdoms, was he potentially like Jaehaerys, or somebody who wasted great opportunities. You don't get the impression that he was necessarily a great father, but as a king, he didn't really get a chance. He seems to have had the right ideas, things that, I mean, these are sensible things that he seemed to be wanting to do when he came into power. That doesn't seem to be particularly ego-driven stuff. So, yeah, I think he could have been a great king. Being a great king does not necessarily mean that he was, therefore, a great father. Aegon was wayward from quite a young age. So if I had to guess, and again, we don't have this information, but if I had to guess, Viserys was probably a bit of a workaholic. And with the loss of his wife, he was the only parental figure for these people, his children. So perhaps they grew up without much of sort of parenting, really. That the instinct that I have. Reflective Rambling saying, if you're giving all of yourself to a country, it's hard to give the same to yourself or your family. Yeah, absolutely. That's the kind of the feel that I get there. Cloaked One saying, hearing that Baelor has been abusing his own body, taking it a different direction. Behave, please, Cloaked One. Thank you very much. Caius Ballerina and Carl Karsnark, all the best for your pets. It looks like they've both been going through quite tough times. Andrew Case saying George R. R. Martin often plays with nature versus nurture, looking at how polar opposite his sons were. Parenting only goes so far. Look how different any siblings can be. Yeah, so George R. R. Martin does often look at this kind of nature versus nurture thing, and it is very clear that the two boys that he has are very, very different. And often George R. R. Martin puts the two the other way around. So the sensible one, who's maybe slightly anxious about life, but probably a good person, but maybe a bit weak, is normally the older one. The younger, or the second son, he often plays a lot with second sons, is often the more rebellious one. Here he flicks this around. The first son, Aegon, is the rebellious one, and the second son, Aemon, is the sort of the one who takes everything very seriously. Let's go to a question from Johnny Seriani saying, greetings, Robert. I know you don't typically rank the rulers of Westeros, but I'd imagine that Viserys would have to be near the top. What was his tax policy? Well, we do not know what his tax policy was going to be. Yes, I think he probably had the potential to be near the top, but he just wasn't in power long enough to sort of rank him. I tend not to, you're right, I tend not to sort of say this is the best, that's the second best, and things like that, because there are so many different aspects to this. And there are some rulers who probably were quite weak, but happened to be in a good period of peace. And there are some who are probably quite good, but they happen to be in quite a terrible period. So it's quite hard to sort of gauge exactly where they all are. What is apparent is that Viserys had the potential to be a very strong king. The fact that people talked about him in the same breath as Jaehaerys, I think, says a huge amount. Fred saying, do you think George R. R. Martin is the best in fantasy world building? Tolkien is good, but maybe a little too metaphysical. I can't think of any writer who created a world that feels so real. I mean, I find myself comparing the Tolkien and George R. R. Martin quite a lot because people ask it quite a lot. I think they're both very different styles. Tolkien created a world that was his life from early age all the way through pretty much to his deathbed, he was adding to this world and tweaking it and changing it. And what we get, we're lucky we've got 2 books that came out from this in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. That's not what Tolkien viewed as being his main story, the main history that he wanted, the world that he wanted to share. But these were just good stories that came off from that. So that, I think, what Tolkien in his Legendarium is incomparable in fantasy literature, in the depth that it was, the language creation, the histories, the legends, things along those lines. What George R. R. Martin has done has been, rather than to start with this great world and then have some stories which sort of branch off from it, he started with the stories and then created the world around it. So it's a very different approach. I absolutely adore what George R. R. Martin has done. I think it's absolutely fabulous, and I think it works on many, many different levels. So I think they're both wonderful. I try my best not to compare them too much. Andrew Kay saying, love George R. R. Martin's world building, but he does a lot more borrowing and nods to other works or concepts via his wider world building. Yeah, he does do that quite a lot. Tolkien also did do that, but to long forgotten mythologies. So we're not as aware of what he did, is my personal take, is that when he borrows from Beowulf, most of us don't know the details of the story of Beowulf. We may well know it at some level, but him taking elements of the burglar who went to steal from the dragon, that kind of thing, that's him borrowing from mythology. Callie Summers with some tinfoil time. Always tinfoil time, Callie. Maesters or someone set up the ambush so that Viserys could be trained like Fagon, maybe even swapped. George R. R. Martin loves making his histories echo. So this is the ambush being when he got captured by the Triarchy fleet. Yeah, I like the idea. I don't think it quite works like that. I don't think that he was taught to be a great king there. I think that he was used as a pawn by the Rogaires. And I think that whereas with Fagon, there were people who were always plotting to get him into power at the end of all of this, I don't think that was the case with Viserys. Josh Croft saying, when the TV show Dunk and Egg comes out, how much background do you think we will get about Aegon the Unworthy and the Great Bastards, or life before the Redgrass Field? I feel casual watchers would miss out. We will definitely get some, but not huge amounts is my guess. I don't know. This is still early days, we have to say, with this Dunk and Egg TV show, and it's currently stuck because of the writer's strike. So when it got announced, they got the first episode written, and then they were thinking it would be 6 episodes, which implies that they'd not done a full proper draft of those 6 episodes. So that's still a long way off. Probably, though, they are pitching this in a slightly different way to how House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones were pitched, which was very much to the adult audience. The books are, they're not children's books, but they are a lot more light in tone when you read those stories, because they're coming from Dunk's perspective as much as anything else. They're a lot lighter, and I think that, or I would hope that they try and replicate that on screen. And what that means is that we will not get huge amounts of big info dumps about stuff that happened in the past. Even in House of the Dragon, we've got a few bits and pieces here or there, but they've not given us huge amounts of history about what happened in Jaehaerys' reign or Maegor the Cruel or anything like that. So I think that talking about what happened a while ago in the Duncan Egg world, not so much. When we get to books 2 and 3, or seasons 2 and 3, or whatever it is that they do it, then I think we might start seeing it, because that's important to the plot. It is important to the plot of the Swan Sword and the Mystery Knight to understand that there was a civil war, to understand about the Blackfires. So in that, they will give us a bit more information. In season 1, maybe a bit, but the important point there, this is who Dunk is, and then what happens when he gets to that 20. The great beauty, just to sort of riff off of this a little bit more, the great beauty of the Dunk and Egg stories is that they will potentially go all the way through Dunk and Egg's life. So we will get a lot more information simply as the story moves on. We will learn more and more about what's going on, and the things that we will learn will be dependent on what George R. Martin wants to write about. So if there's a story about the sword Blackfire, just random, not saying there will be or anything, but if there were, then we would get a lot of information about that. Let's go to a question from King of Imps saying, I'll be listening to tonight's live stream while playing Traveller's Rest, a tavern keeper simulator where you run an inn in a fantasy land. Your live streams are always a perfect accompaniment. I've not heard of Traveller's Rest. I mean, I hope that you can welcome all the weary travelers you possibly can there. But my question is this. Tyrion argues that the Lives of 4 Kings book he tries to give to Joffrey should really be titled The Lives of 5 Kings. I was reading that passage a little bit earlier, because Viserys II is left out. Oberyn Martell argues against him, saying Viserys wasn't very notable. Who was right? And what does their particular point of view tell us about where their characters are in A Song of Ice and Fire? So, I think I've probably answered so far the first part of that, whether Viserys is important. Clearly, he's very important. But those two characters, Oberyn and Tyrion, are both well read. They're both intelligent. They both can read history books and assess them, and not just take them at their word. So what is George R. R. Martin doing? Well, he does this quite a lot. He wants to show individual characters through how they react. Tyrion is very thoughtful, and he is the kind of person who thinks what is good ruling. If he became king himself, what would he do? He would probably immediately be going there doing laws and trying to start up trade agreements, exactly the kind of thing that Viserys started trying to do. And he will have looked behind the scenes at what was going on with those other kings and thought, well, there's somebody here. From his own perspective, having been a hand of the king, he understands that there must have been somebody there who was pulling the strings. Oberyn comes across as a character who is very passion-driven. He is just trying to do the thing he wants to do, get revenge. And as a result, he looks at that history book and he goes, well, this guy's not interesting. He doesn't do anything. Maybe he did murder someone to get the throne, but he doesn't do anything with it when he gets it. All he does is enact a few laws. And this, therefore, is telling us about these two characters and what roles they are. Tyrion is actually naturally the hand of the king behind the scenes. He is a bit like Viserys II. That's what we're trying to be told. He can see the good things that Viserys II did, but he's not being recognized for them. He will be forgotten by history to a degree because he is doing the sensible, boring things. And we see this again and again in the Song of Ice and Fire. Yes, he is largely to thank for saving King's Landing in the Battle of the Blackwater. Is he at all recognized for that? No, not at all. That's nobody really gives him gratitude for it. His father recognizes it because his father's a clever man, but then it's like, yeah, but I'm not going to be thanking you, I'm going to be doing a ticker tape parade for you or nothing like that. This is just what you should be doing. But Tyrion is quite like that Viserys II character. Oberyn Martell is a lot more like Aegon IV, or maybe even in his own way like Deeren or Baelor, because they are very driven from the heart. They're doing the things that they want to do. They are achieving things. So for him to say, what did Viserys achieve? Nothing. He didn't do anything. That's him saying, what is worthy of remembrance? Passion. Doing the things you ought to be doing the things that really drive you. So he is showing us these two characters through how they discuss and how they approach this one historical character. Let's go to a question from King of Imps saying, hey Robert, I'll be no, this is the one I was just answering actually. Let's go to a question from Kristen H saying, hi Robert, happy to hear you discuss someone who is in my opinion one of the most underrated of the Targaryen rulers. When he became king, much of Viserys' focus was in improving the kingdom's finances, increasing commerce with the free cities, creating a new mint, etc. My question is, do you think his understanding of finances is related to the time he spent with the Roger family? Is there any indication that he was taught by them how to manage finances? We're not told this, but this is a really interesting point. Because, yes, this is what he did. This is what he prioritized. A new mint, a new way of basically printing money in King's Landing, establishing new trade routes. He wanted the Seven Kingdoms to be strong, and he equated that to being prosperous, to having a full treasury. Now, does that mean that he was taught by the Roger family? No, not necessarily, but that does mean that he's perhaps learnt the lessons of history. He will definitely have been brought up. He was still a child, let's not forget, when he went over there to Lys. He will have been brought up within a more mercantilist feel than he had been on Dragonstone, where he didn't have to worry about money at all. When he went to Lys, then that was the biggest thing they were concerned about, is money. And that definitely will have had an impact on him as he was growing up. But also, he seems to be one of the few people who can stop, take a step back and go, okay, so what lessons can we learn from the Dance of the Dragons? Lesson number one, he goes, we haven't got any dragons. We need dragons now. Lesson number two, he goes, well, okay, why did the blacks fail? They ran out of money. We need to have a new mint here in King's Landing. So he seems to have actually sat down, whether he actually did it this way or it was instinct, we don't know, but he seems to have sat down and considered, what is it that we need? What are the lessons that we can learn from the past? How do we make the Targaryens strong going on into the future? So there's no direct evidence that the Rogers taught him these things, but compared to every other Targaryen, pretty much, he had an upbringing within a merchant environment, as opposed to being just brought up to say, I want this, and somebody bringing it to you. So that, I think, will undoubtedly have had an impact. Let's go to a question from Joby Guajardo, or Yobi perhaps, saying, hello from Texas. Hi there. What is your opinion on Alice Rivers? Was she really just a bastard from House Strong? What happened to her and her son with Aemond? Okay, so this is sort of slightly moving away from Viserys here. If you've got more questions, I think I've just done the last question from one of my patrons about Viserys II. If you've got more questions about Viserys II, now is the time to put them in the chat. I'll try and pick up on them, but I will happily pick up on this about Alice Rivers. So we're going to meet Alice Rivers. It's probably worth saying this is one of the people they have now cast for House of the Dragon Season 2. So we are going to see her appearing in House of the Dragon Season 2. For those who have not read the books or who need a reminder, this is a character who is at Harrenhal, and Harrenhal, if you remember, was held by House Strong, and then there was a fire, and poor old Harwin Strong and his dad died there, and who survived? Well, various people did. One of these people was Alice Rivers. Now, her name is a bastard-born name, which seems to imply that she had at least one noble parent, but she was born out of wedlock somewhere. We get various reports in Fire and Blood, which we have to read through this kind of prism of where the maesters come from. Any woman who they don't like or they find slightly mysterious, it must be doing some sort of magic and must be a witch and must be frowned upon in some way. So maybe she did have magical powers. Was she much older than she looked? We don't know. What we do know is that Aemond Targaryen did seem to fall in love with her. And Daemon had previously not, but Aemond did. And she has his child. She gives birth to this child, who she claims is therefore the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. And this is one of the big issues which is hanging over from the end of Fire and Blood Part 1, which we will see. The Targaryens have to deal with this threat, this potential claimant, and we're not shown where this goes. She announces herself and the fact that she says that she has got a Targaryen child in a magical way. Now, what's going to happen to her? I think she will. I mean, she clearly isn't there in the current story. We don't hear about her going forward. After this, I think she will be dealt with and dispatched by the Targaryens. I do wonder whether they will send. They do still have a dragon, Morning. I do wonder whether they will send the dragon there. Morning has to die somehow. And a magic user is probably as good a way for the last Targaryen dragon to die as any other. So yeah, I think that's what it is. Is she really a bastard from House Strong? It seems quite likely to me. What will happen to her? I think she will die, but I think that she will cause some damage. Charis Ballerina saying, didn't Viserys II do to Dana what Aegon II tried to do to his mum? How do you think he felt about that? Also, why never try to repair his mum's reputation? Well, this is an interesting one. So when Viserys II came to power, he wasn't the named heir. There was no real named heir. Baelor didn't really name an heir. And there were some people who said this should be Dana, who was the sister to Baelor. But it's brushed over quite quickly in the world of Ice and Fire. But we're told that, firstly, Dana didn't really have many supporters because she'd been stuck in the Maiden Vault for a while, so not many people really knew her, so she hadn't really got many people on side. Whereas Viserys clearly was at the heart of power in the Red Keep. So him becoming king was a lot easier because he could just get people on side a lot easier. So that's the first thing. The second thing was there was a recent memory of Rhaenyra and what had happened when she sat on the Iron Throne. And let's not forget Rhaenyra. Whether they go down this route on the show, we'll have to wait and see. But in the books, Rhaenyra's 6 months in power is not entirely her fault by any stretch of the imagination, but it was pretty horrible for the people of King's Landing. Taxes went up hugely. There was a reign of terror, people being executed, heads put on sticks, a bit of a famine, people starving. It was not good. Eventually, this is what led to the uprising, which led to the storming of the Dragon Pit and her basically getting hounded out of town. So, yes, it's entirely unfair to say, well, last time a woman sat on the Iron Throne, that happened, therefore we shouldn't allow it again. But Viserys, this actually worked in his favor. Assuming he wanted to be king and he didn't want Dana to be king, having people say, well, we can't allow a woman to be king again, or to be queen, to be monarch, actually worked in his favor. So that will be why in the short term he didn't try to help defend her reputation. If he'd survived longer, I suspect he probably would have done. But let's not forget that he didn't actually know his mother that well. So he was 6 when he got sent away, and that's it. And so his memories of her will be quite limited to those of a very small child. He was not brought up for his teenage years, for the later parts of his childhood, by his family. He was brought up by someone else. Let's go to a question from Travis. This is the last question from my patron. So as I say, now's a good time to drop more questions into the chat. Travis saying, on an unrelated topic, am I the only one annoyed that Dunk and Egg aren't going to be under the banner of House of the Dragon? Isn't House of the Dragon supposed to be an anthology about the Targaryen family at various points in Westerosi history? If it was just about the Dance of the Dragons, wouldn't a more compelling name be the Dance of the Dragons? You don't have to address this, but me ranting here keeps other folks in my life slightly more sane. Well, I'm very happy to address it. I'm happy with Dunk and Egg being its own thing, because I think that gives it the freedom to have a slightly different style. So I'm okay with that. As for the anthology issue, House of the Dragon, yes, this is what we've been told, is that the idea is that this will be an anthology of Targaryen rulers, basically, and important moments in Targaryen history. The suggestion is perhaps they might go back to Aegon the Conqueror after this, maybe a bit later when we've got Fire and Blood Part 2, they might do Blackfire Rebellions or something like that, but not Dunk and Egg. I think if they tried to do Dunk and Egg under this, then it would be a very different feel to what we've got so far in House of the Dragon. Not just in terms of the darkness of it and things like that, but Dunk and Egg should operate, here's a short story about something which is, in the grand scheme of things, doesn't actually affect anything to do with the How Targaryen. It's just a fun story to do with these two characters, like the Sworn Sword, for example. What happens there? Yes, it has some implications wider, but really it's not a massive deal. And we will get other things like that coming up. George R. R. Martin has already hinted there's going to be one based in Winterfell. There's going to be one to do with the Brackens and the Blackwoods, both of which will be fascinating, and they will expand our understanding of the Seven Kingdoms. But they're not central to Targaryen rule. So I'm actually okay with this. I'm okay with Dunk and Egg being a separate entity with a distinct style. If they had tried to make it there, it would be about what's the moment of Aegon V's rule that we want to be showing here, not here's all these moments right from when he's a very small child to the moment when he dies, which is what I think Dunk and Egg should be. Let's go to Custy Angel saying, can you please stream about Queens of Love and Beauty, wet nurses, and milkmen or brothers? I think there'll be a lot of important info to uncover delving in. Yeah, I mean, that's a good idea. Okay, let me think. I will add that to my list. I've got a very long list of things that I want to be doing live streams about. Lucian saying, have to head off now. Great to see you. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Andrew K saying, I really hope they lean into some of Alice's magic on House of the Dragon. Seems some interesting, somewhat unique magic with her, if rumors are true. Yeah, I hope they do get into that, because House of the Dragon's not been that. Yes, there's obviously dragons, but the magic side has been a lot lower, so it would be really fun if we had a very clear magic bit. Carl Karsnark saying Ali would be badass from a purely visual perspective to see her on screen. Bloodraven 2, of course. Yeah, we'll when we get to him, that will be casting I'll be obsessing over, I can assure you. Ranabir Mitra saying, now that Robert is speaking about Alice Rivers, someone should page Joe Magician. I was actually talking to him just earlier, actually. I will have him on this channel again at some point soon. Do not worry. Ranabir Mitra saying, are you a fan of Joe Magician's ideas of Targaryens having dreams? Imagine Viserys II having dreams regarding dragons, hence the push to Aegon III. Yeah, maybe he did. I mean, I don't know what Matt's theory there is, but Targaryens being dragon dreamers is clearly well established. So the question is whether Viserys might be one. I always love there to be interesting slants on this. I actually quite like this idea that Viserys is just a really almost boringly sensible person who just is efficient and effective and wants to rule. And that means that he doesn't try and get or try and talk his brother around to get dragons back because he's had some dragon dream, but simply because he recognizes in a way that his brother doesn't seem to, that dragons are needed in order to back up Targaryen power, and this is just a very pragmatic response to the situation of what's going on. So I actually quite like that more straightforward response or possibility there. Ranabir Mitra asking about third and the season end. Eric Ten Hag did a good job. That's a football question. Yes, I thought this was a really good, positive season. More to do. But yeah, I felt that was good. Amanda Horst saying, would you say that Viserys II had more of his dad or mum in him during his rule? Yeah, so this is an interesting one because he doesn't, both of those two children, being Aegon and him, we don't look at them and go, oh yeah, that's just like Daemon. Similarly, we don't look at them and go, oh, that's just like Rhaenyra. And it's because neither of them were really brought up by their parents. So, and Aegon was traumatized by what he saw. So he was reacting against things and he was going deep into his shell for certain things. whereas Viserys was brought up abroad by different people with different thoughts and ways of approaching life. So I don't think he was particularly like either of his parents. What we do see is it kind of skips the generation. So his two, we know less about his daughter, but his two sons, Aemon, the Dragon Knight, definitely seems to have a bit of Daemon to him, but like the good side rather than the nasty side. And then you get Aegon, who seems to inherited some of the nasty side, not the good side of Daemon. As for Rhaenyra, certainly in Aegon, you see quite a lot of her response to stressful situations coming out through him. Viserys, you don't see much. Maybe when he was younger, he did seem to have we're told that he was he had more of a sparkle about him than his brother did. Martin S. Asking, this is about A Song of Ice and Fire here, if Renly had backed Stannis' claim to the throne, would the Tyrells have followed? Probably. The thing is, though, that what would the Tyrells have got from that? The reason why the Tyrells went with Renly is twofold. Firstly, because they thought that they could win with them, and secondly, because they could get their daughter Marjorie to be married to the future king, and that would then obviously propel them to much greater power in the long run. Now, with Stannis, they wouldn't have had that at all, nor probably would they have had much by way of preferential treatment, because Stannis would just see people as, oh, of course you're following me, I'm the rightful king. Well, you don't deserve any extra gold stars or anything just because you've said that you're going to be throwing your weight behind me. That's what you should be doing anyway. Kelly Summers asking how I'd compare Viserys II to Tywin as somebody who effectively ran the kingdom from the background, effectively, but with very different styles. Yeah, there are a few characters like Otto Hightower is another one. Incidentally, we think of him just as the character within the context of the Dance of the Dragons, but before that, when he was Hand of the King, he seems to have been genuinely efficient and effective at his job. The apex, the height of Targaryen power came not under Jaehaerys, but under Viserys I. And the Hand of the King for most of that time was Otto Hightower. And it's very clear that Viserys I wasn't paying that much attention to running the Seven Kingdoms. So who's responsible for it? His hand, Otto Hightower. So I think there's definitely a bit of that. Tywin we know more about. Tywin, basically, he was such a big and strong character that the king turned against him. That doesn't seem to have been what happened with Viserys. Viserys seems to have had better interpersonal skills than Tywin did. Sebastian Holden saying, let's be honest, Stannis would have been a terrible king, the rightful king. But yes, I know exactly what you mean. Having a quick flick through, see if there's any other questions. Wheezy Squeezebox saying, dragons make it so much easier to rule if your house is the only house that has them. Yes, absolutely. People who didn't know who Matt was, Gem Magician, his name is Matt. That's who I was talking about there. And I think that is me caught up on the chat. So what I will do is I'll say next time what we're going to be looking at is the next of these kings, which is Aegon IV. Now, Aegon IV is known as Aegon the Unworthy, and he's generally considered one of the worst kings. Is that justified? We'll sort of talk through it. He seems to have not been, I'm not going to spoil too much for next time, but he seems not to have been a particularly good king. He seems not to have been able to sort of channel his behaviors in any particularly positive way, and he clearly left the succession so wide open that it caused a civil war. So there are echoes here, I think, of Viserys I, but we will come back to him next time. What I haven't done is say thank you to my patrons. Patrons, thank you so much. This is why I frame these live streams around your questions, because I just want to say thank you for supporting me. But if you would like to watch more videos, live streams that I've been doing, then appearing a bit around here. Afterwards will be a link to some of those. If you would like to support this channel, the best way to do that is by clicking on the link somewhere around here. Afterwards to Patreon. Moderators, thank you so much. Again, if this is your first time, then welcome. Please do go and check out not just this, but my main channel in Deep Geek, if you'd like more content. But I will see you same time again here next week. Take care, everyone.